our Q&A, our panel discussion now.
So Tess, there are 2 questions in the chat. Perhaps you could address those 2, and then we'll move on to the rest of the session.
Okay, I'm looking at the... Would you mind just reading them out? Sorry, Ajib.
Sure,
Yeah.
no problem.
Yeah.
So the first question, you talked about elevating the level of discourse on corruption. As a journalist, is it important to avoid sensationalism in the discourse on corruption?
Okay, this is where the value of IJ or investigative journalism comes in, because you cannot resort to sensationalism when you follow the paper trail, the people trail, you do field work and observation. There's no way you can sensationalize because everything is backed up by data and fact. In my case, when I did the number of reports I wrote for PCIJ, I spent a lot of time obtaining documents because I could not rely on the mere say-so of my sources, even if I found them credible. There's no way you can sensationalize when you do adequate paper trail. I mean, getting as much documents as you need to be able to verify what is otherwise is just allegation, for example. And this is also where we earn more credibility from the public, because when the public sees that what we claim in our stories is backed up by data, backed up by investigation, backed up by documents that otherwise are available to them, then the public would be able to see that, these are not just allegations, these are not just claims, but really verifiable information in terms of what this public official, for example, or this public institute is doing, like in terms of the allocation of public funds, for example. Yeah. I hope I addressed that.
Sure. In the next question, what do you feel is the greatest challenge for Southeast Asian journalists in covering corruption? Do journalists in other countries experience the same issues? And I guess what's meant here is basically, what are the unique challenges in Southeast Asia that you won't find in, let's say, covering corruption in a Western country?
Well, in terms of the extent of repression, the challenges are greater relative to other countries that don't experience the same level of repression. For example, when the simple act of trying to obtain documents, you encounter restrictions from the government, it makes it more difficult for you to do your investigative report, because otherwise, without those supporting documents, there's no way you can come up with really a credible report. Other challenges would be resources. It takes resources to do investigative work. If news outfits are not willing to invest in investigative reports, there's no way you can come up with one. And at this time, especially during this time of pandemic, news organizations are either shutting down or have significantly cut back on their operations, which affects the volume of stories that they're able to put out. So those are 2 challenges that I'm seeing. And of course, the political will of organizations, of media organizations. In the Philippines, not just Rappler, but even some the biggest newspaper, Philippine Daily Inquirer, have received direct threats from President Duterte, and this intimidates them in coming up with scathing reports on what's really going on. So I wouldn't say that the challenges are unique to Southeast Asia, but they're more pronounced in our region than elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. We have another question coming in, just one more. Are there any ASEAN media support organizations that journalists can be a part of to collaborate on cross-border stories?
I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any at this moment, but I would say that the opportunities are there for us to come together, even if we don't have we're not organized as groups.
Right.
Because, for example, and we're hoping to do that at Asia Democracy Chronicles on similar themes. For example, somebody in India doing a story on press freedom, another for example, in in Malaysia, for instance, and then you bring these stories together. That could be as simple as that, and you have a cross-border story, mainly to provide a broader picture of what's going on and to show to the public that this situation is now regional in scope, and this is not just country specific. So at individual levels, I think journalists can come together, agree on doing stories, but I think some organizations are more open to being tapped for potential collaborative pieces because issues now are cross-border. And it doesn't make sense to just confine our stories to our geographical borders and I think there's a practical side to it also. What you cannot publish in your country, you can get it published elsewhere. And, because then you don't have to fear being charged or slapped with cyber libel, for instance. Those are some practical practical things that could be considered at the very least. Yeah. I'm quite optimistic about the prospects for collaboration because I see that there are more and more efforts in that regard, and journalists, including as part of my experience as editor-in-chief of Asia Democracy Chronicles, are now more open to collaboration. Yeah. Very quickly, there's a question here before we go for a break. In Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, it was hoped that removing corrupt leaders would eliminate corruption. Does getting rid of a corrupt leader reduce corruption, or are social factors more important?
I think that it helped. Obviously, if there's as I mentioned earlier in the corruption formula, if we have high monopoly, in this case, corrupt leaders, there's higher likelihood that there will be more corruption. But the problem doesn't stop there. If even we remove the corrupt leaders, but the check and balance system, as I mentioned earlier, that, for example, democracy is not that simple. It requires check and balance system. It requires power to really be on the hand of the people. If we don't have the system in place, it will be likely that there will be new corrupt leaders. Bureaucrats and politicians will be able to use their discretion to create more corruption. So we need to reduce both of them, and at the end, and at the same time, increase accountability. But that sounds simple, right? It's not like no. I just say that it sounds simple, but it has high complexity behind each of the factors.
Yeah. In many instances, it's just the players that change.
Yes, obviously.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Do we have another, Ajib? You said there were two. Sorry, before we go for a break.
Sure, there's one more. Just give me one moment.
Okay. Maybe you can just read it out, please.
Sure, yeah, I can do that. So we have another question on the issue of linguistics. So your section on linguistics and discourse was very interesting. How do Southeast Asian languages, like Thai, for instance, how do they present ideas on corruption? And I guess a good question to ask in connection to that is Southeast Asian, what does Southeast Asian culture say about corruption as well?
Well, I believe that it has a different kind, the way you use and the words you use to compare corruption affect our behavior as just like in the example I show. But unfortunately, we weren't able to use like computable linguistics to calculate words in other language apart from English, because it's different language, especially Thai and other languages in Southeast Asia are so highly complex. So that's why we use Bangkok Post and Jakarta Post. But based on that rationale, that even English words can affect our behavior, I'm sure that that words in other language do have effect on our behavior as well. And comparing corruption with like we say we eat something, we just eat something, it makes corruption less aggressive, less of a devastating effect than using corruption as as I mentioned earlier, devil or disease, something like that.
This is very interesting. We wish we could extend the discussion. There might be more questions.
Okay, there's another question for Dr. Nadir specifically. In the 80s and 90s, we saw massive protests against corrupt rulers in Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia. What role do movements such as Reformasi play in solving corruption? In other words, how do social movements, grassroots movements, can that be a solution for ending corruption in ASEAN?
Yes, that social movement is really important to gain the momentum. Right? And then once you get the momentum, then people could propose to make an amendment to anti-corruption laws and also to frying the big fish to follow that method. But you could not stop there, right? That's what happened in those countries that you asked. The efforts to combat corruptions after several years, then they lost the momentum again, right? Then everything back to business as usual. So then the question is for the activists how to keep the momentum, right? And sometimes it's difficult. Like for instance, in Indonesia, after the 2019 presidential elections, President Jokowi gained the momentum to run the country for the second term, but then his government amended the 2002 KPK law, Anti-Corruption Commission law, which reduced the power of KPK. So this is the problem. Instead of trying to strengthen, because he just won the elections, people supported him, right? But he reduced the power of anti-corruption commissions. And at the time, there was another massive demonstrations, right? But it lost the momentum, right? Because we just finished the election and people voted for the second time. So that's why then we need to keep the momentum. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Tess, did you want to move on to the Q&A session?
Yeah, you have another question here. Is that for Dr. Nadir also? You talk about...
That is for Dr. Torplas. Would you like me to read the questions? So
yeah, please. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So this question is for Dr. I'll just spin myself as well. So for Dr. Torplas, you talked about how culture is used to explain corruption. Are there any aspects of traditional Southeast Asian culture that can reduce corruption?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think Dr. Nadia has covered this issue.
Yes. I think that was Dr. Nadia. Yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to respond to this?
Yes. Yes. Our approach is that we don't use culture as a justification. We use culture as an explanation. Then the question whether there is also an element in the culture that we can use to justify the anti-corruption effort, right? Well, in Asia, there's also a culture of shaming, right? So then once your family got arrested, it will bring a shame to the whole family, right? Then we can use that in order to combat the corruptions. Right? The problem is that, of course, then in the cities, in the metropolitan cities, no longer we have such a bond in a big family. We become individualists, more and more individualists, right? So then even this culture is like a direct contradictions with another traditions of supporting your family. Right? When you reach the top positions, we need to support you, right? But once you are declared as a corrupt, you are arrested, then the family said that, well, we still need to support this guy, right? Because we already get so much money, so much. So what's the law should do? Then there is some suggestions. We could post the picture of the corrupt in the media, then this is like a shaming. Even in social media, we could put them. Then at least then the family will feel that, well, this guy bring the shame to our family. But there's, of course, then there's another issue about the human rights, right? So then we need to be careful if we want to use this method. But my point is that I don't believe that the culture in Asia accommodates corruptions like that. Right? I think those who use corruption issues, culture issues, is like a garbage bin, because they could not provide any other solutions, right? Then they said that, well, this is a culture. So again,
easy explanation.
Easy explanation, yes. Right, and sadly to say, some of people outside Asia, like from International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, some of them also subscribe to these ideas. Right? They said that whatever you do in Asia, you could not remove corruption because that's a culture. Right?
Is it one of those, sorry, Dr. Nadir, is it one of those narratives that need to be debunked by the media if we are to write about corruption the way we should and in a manner that will help address the issue of corruption in the region, in our respective countries at the very least? And do you find other narratives that need to be debunked as well when it comes to covering corruption? Could you expound on this a bit more? Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
May I add?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, just a little bit to this. I happened to got to read the new article by Professor Bo Rothstein of the Gothenburg University. He mentioned about this as well, and similar to what Dr. Nadir has just mentioned, that this is just like an easy way out for explaining why corruption is still prevail in different countries, especially in ASEAN and Asia's country. And he suggested that there are lots of surveys which actually ask people how they think about corruption, and 90% of the people who answer these surveys suggested that they hate corruption and they think that corruption is devastated to the country. But the way that factors, the structure, the political structure, the socio-political structure in many countries just facilitates this, he called and quote, standard operating procedures of the countries, which means this standard operating procedures, which allow us to, actually provoke us to tend to corrupt, actually is the on may be on the contract what should I say, may contradict our thoughts and ethics and culture. So it's not the culture that could be the answer to why our anti-corruption fails or corruption prevails, but because of other factors, of structural factors as well.
Yeah. And not subscribing to that thinking would have a lot of impact, I think, on how we would cover corruption, we in the media. Okay, there's another question here. The weakening of corruption eradication has occurred in the last 2 years in Indonesia with the amendment of as mentioned by Dr. Nadir earlier, the election of people who have violated ethics to become leader of the organization, and the dismissal of investigators with integrity through a system of staffing status transfers known as the Nationalist Insight Test, or the TWK. My question is, does the same thing happen in other ASEAN countries, and how journalists across the region can collaborate in order to tackle this issue? Anyone of our speakers could address this question.
So just to give the background of that question and things, there's a TWK that he or she mentions. It's about civic knowledge test. So in the last 2 years, Indonesia was dealing with radicalism and extremism and politicization of religion. But then the government smartly used this narrative. They said that there is a Taliban in KPK, in the anti-corruption agencies, and then then when the Jokowi administration amended the law, that they said that now the independent members of KPK should become the government official, and then they need to pass the test, what they call a civic knowledge test. And then around 57 didn't pass the test because they're not nationalist enough, and they're part of this Taliban. They're radicals, right? So they use this idea of religion in order to remove the efforts of anti-corruption commission. And this is really ridiculous because some of these members of the 57, 57 that didn't pass the civic knowledge test, they're not Muslims. So no way they'll be subscribed to the idea of Taliban, right, of extremisms. But again, successfully with the support of people in Indonesia using this narrative, then the government reduced the capacity of KPK. So then whether this also happened in other regions, other countries, I don't know. So maybe some of you can explain.
Yeah. To be sure, there are similar efforts elsewhere in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, to weaken institutions that otherwise have an important role to play in addressing corruption. There's one question here addressed to Cynthia. Suspected corruptors from my country sometimes hide in other ASEAN countries to avoid legal proceedings. How should ASEAN take a role to deal with issues like this?
Thank you for that question. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to say something about the law enforcement, the question earlier that Dr. Nadia was answering. In the case of Malaysia, we have always looked up to KPK Indonesia as a good example of what an anti-corruption commission should be and should actually do, that even politicians and judges fear the Anti-Corruption Commission. It was that independent before the law got amended. And I think this is where I'm having a little bit of difficulty with the discussions around culture, because for me, the issue is about power. Corruption is about power, and it is not something which is cultural. It becomes cultural when power allows it to permeate into society for the benefit of quid pro quo, for the benefit of a status quo of the situation. So what is happening to our Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission now, I think it's really quite a crisis, because we find that officials in the commission are stealing the money that they had seized as part of the stolen assets. So now they've become thieves themselves, because it's so tempting to actually look at all the loot that was stolen over the entire 1MDB cause, etc. So there's no more trust that you can place on a commission. So how do you deal with addressing power to ensure that a downgrade, like what happened to KPK, I call it a downgrade because it was such an independent institution before, will not happen to other institutions. So what is it that civil society, journalists, and people can do? I think it's a very, very important question to answer, that it should be in election pledges, it should be something codified or something that's written, that we can hold governments to ensure that bills or parliaments will not be passed to allow for greater executive interference and all that. So it's a power question. So in relation to that, this question to me that I wanted to answer is also linked, because it's about how corrupted offenders are actually allowed to avoid legal proceedings and to hide in some countries. So even in our story of the 1MDB, we are still unable to track the main culprits who stole all that loot. And we hear that it's actually China that's hiding Jolo, and that's hiding the criminal in exchange for economic benefits that they can have in the country. So it's a win-win situation for both. But for ASEAN, there needs to be developed more established, like extradition treaties. How do you actually get a particular corrupt offender hiding, say, in Laos or in Myanmar or in Cambodia, when they actually need to be brought to Malaysia or Singapore or Philippines to be tried in court, etc. There's no systemic process that I'm aware of that will allow these things to happen. So this is where it's really important to develop that kind of cohesive narrative to be built up, that this is what ASEAN needs to do in the context of 2025 and what the political security blueprint needs to mean for the ASEAN people, because it is a national security issue. And one more line on national security, that if any of us are following what's happening in the US, it's quite interesting how Biden's administration has actually now defined corruption as a national security issue. And whether that is something ASEAN needs to also evolve in that direction, that it actually jeopardizes the security of nations if we allow corrupt leaders to just be left without any kind of accountability mechanism placed on them. So these are very important questions to answer, but just a quick answer is there's no structure at the moment to actually allow those hiding outside the country to be brought back.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. This might sound cynical, but should we even be looking to ASEAN, the regional bloc, for measures to address corruption in the issue, given how weak, at least that's the widespread perception of ASEAN, the regional bloc, not the region. Yeah. Would you like to address that? Yeah, Cynthia.
Yeah. Is there another question?
No, Tess was asking the question about Tess, did you want to repeat?
Yeah, no, I said, should we even be looking to ASEAN, the regional bloc, on matters like this, given how weak, ASEAN is? Again, the regional bloc, not the region. Yeah.
I actually think the strategy should be two-pronged. One is to develop strength among ourselves, knowing that the regional bloc is weak, but sometimes they can surprise us, like what's happening with the summit and how they have left Myanmar out. It's quite shocking that a weak association would actually take that kind of action. But it was also because there's enough pressure to ensure that a decision like that could be taken. So I just think that as we strengthen our own discourse and our own narrative, then it becomes stronger when we want to engage with the ASEAN Secretariat or the ASEAN Foundation, etc. But at the same time, I also think that within ASEAN as a block of governments would be the hardest to penetrate. There are many other sectors in ASEAN that we might need to engage to be stakeholders that can join us in the fight against corruption. And one of it could be the legal networks, the academic networks, and also the corporate sector, which in many of our eyes are also the crooks, because they're usually the givers of the bribes, the ones that facilitate and enable a particular corruption to happen. Sometimes it could also be because that's just how it is. That's just, in one of my slides, I talked about the cost of doing business, that you have to ensure a certain portion of money is actually given out for corruption, for gift giving, for bribes, etc. And whether turning the tide against corruption would also mean gaining support from other stakeholders before we deal with the governments, which are the most difficult.
Thank you, Cynthia. There's a question here from Danny addressed to me. Is there any journalism collaborative that focuses on corruption in ASEAN? Honestly, I don't know of any, but maybe any one of the participants. Sorry to single out Carmela of PCIJ. I know she's here. Would you know of any? I'm not aware. Focusing on ASEAN. I suppose Danny meant ASEAN, the bloc. or maybe the region as well. Anyone? Anyway, you could type it into the
As an
chat.
organization, I'm not sure. I don't think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Carmela. Oh, I think this presents an opportunity. This is something to
Yeah.
explore. Kini Academy, for example, might want to, consider this. But yeah, I've written stories on ASEAN, including on migrant labor. And my sense was there's much to look into where how it functions is concerned. So and that's my strong sense at the time. As I wrote some stories on issues surrounding the regional
Just to
government.
follow up and to understand whether journalists would be motivated to set up not a whole institute or structure, but like an alliance to do more writing for the region, investigative type of writing for the region, because it can be quite, not so motivating to look at ASEAN as a bloc, because then we get into all these non-interference issues and stuff. But about calling out corruption through what I was trying to espouse just now about transnational crimes, cross-border corruption issues, etc. There can be more narratives written around that.
Right.
That kind of alliance would be so powerful.
Yeah. That's quite exciting to hear, actually. And you've given us very good leads for potential stories, actually. I wanted to say that. There was a question here from Cherry Salazar of PCIJ. She asked this earlier. Digital tech has made publishing and content creation more accessible. Anyone can now post their own articles and videos online. With social media essentially programmed to be like echo chambers, legitimate media is struggling to preserve public trust. How can we strengthen and maintain that trust and integrity in this age of disinformation? Even if our stories are groundbreaking, it won't affect policies so much if it's easily dismissed by propagandists, if public doubts our integrity as journalists. So this is addressed to me. I'm a firm believer, and this might sound very how would I call it? I'm a firm believer in the power of stories. When I was actively writing as an investigative journalist, I posed this question to myself: what impact would my story have, given the amount of work I did, the risks I took to be able to put out these stories? But I figured maybe the impact is not immediate, but it's one story at a time and taking things one step at a time in our effort to, again, I go back to what I said earlier about raising the level of discourse. If only x number of people, readers, get to understand the situation at hand, maybe along the way more people will understand. So I try to maintain that mindset in the course of my journalistic work. It's far more difficult nowadays, I think, to be putting out investigative stories because we're up against all these challenges, including disinformation, of course, the trolls, being deployed no less by the government. But imagine a world, or imagine our individual countries without these kinds of stories coming out. People remaining clueless as to what's happening. So that's a huge price to pay, I think. The public not understanding at all what's going on. So, stories can easily as Cherry puts it, can easily be dismissed by propagandists. But readers, I believe, would still be able to distinguish a good story, a well-researched story, from one that's really just quote unquote fake news. Out there are still discerning readers, and we need to cater to them. And because and they're looking for those kinds of stories, and we need to be able to to fill that gap where our public needs for well-written, well-researched, carefully put together stories is concerned. So that's how I would respond to. Any other maybe from the perspectives of our speakers, Nadir, Nick, Cynthia, any thoughts?
Yes, I think because we live in a digital era, so then we need to combine between the stories published by the journalists in the published media with a posting in the social media. But there is also another issue, I think, which is that it's easy to access and publish any stories through social media right now. Whereas if we want to have a quality investigative report from a journalist, then usually it is not cheap, and then the readers need to pay to access from the website of the media, and so this is a problem, right? There's such a good report from Tempo. I see that some of Tempo magazines, journalists or Koran Tempo here. There is some good investigative report from Koran Tempo or Majalah Tempo, but because we need to pay the subscription, then not many people can read it, and then people will only read some rumors or some gossip or the propagandists in the social media. That's another issue. That no one will read your report if they have to pay. So there should be a balanced approach here at the media. But at the same time, how can the media survive with this under this digital era, right? If there is no subscription, so that's another issue. I don't know what you're thinking about that, Tess.
Yeah. The other way of looking at it is there are readers willing to pay for good stories. That's why there are some media outlets that still have subscription base. So I think we need to revisit our notion about our readers, that they're just after free stories, because there are readers. I think New Narrative, I'm a subscriber to New Narrative. I mean, this is my second year with my annual subscription, meaning to say there are still segments of readers, I think, that are willing to pay for good stories. But we also need need to think in terms of how to make our stories more accessible. And while trying to generate more revenue streams, for example, getting creative about it so that we will be able to sustain our operations as media and continue to provide our readers, our audience, with good stories. Any thoughts from Nick and from Cynthia, maybe from civil society and academic perspective? And then we'll move
Actually,
to the final portion.
I think it needs to be exciting. So it should not be daunting that, we're just like, oh my God, what do we do? But it could start giving Danny more ideas and work. But it could start like what Kenya Academy is doing now, is to develop more programs like this where we generate more content, because part of what I understand from all my engagements with journalists is a lack of investigative flavor, at least for Malaysian journalists. So they're good at writing stories based on what happened in the news today and to capture just that. So the whole capacity building that's required to probe deeper, to follow the paper trail, follow the money, etc., requires a lot more time and energy, which also needs resources. So those things need to be established in order for us to map some issues that we might want to take on in a pilot project for, say, 6 months, that we want to develop 20 stories that are cross-border, that are not specific to one country alone. And then that can be built so that we can share it on all the different media that was shared just now, like Rappler, Malaysia Kini, different New Narrative and all that can actually start hosting these stories, and then we can have a portal, anti-corruption blogs, etc., just to build some interest that these issues are real. Because I think we need to step up the plate because the criminals are stepping up their plate.
Right.
So we need to defeat the narrative that they are using to counter it with, different narratives to fight corruption. So the title of this event is great because it's called Turning the Tide, but turning the tide requires a whole initiative. So I would just suggest that we have a pilot thing, that if we can find resources to do a 20 or 30 stories thing over 6 months, and park it maybe at Kenya Academy or some entity that's willing to actually expand it beyond this. Because corruption is not just about corruption, it actually links to the rule of law, to democratic
human rights.
That's right, human rights and everything. So it can actually encompass many issues. And I think climate change is like a huge area that has many intersections with corruption. So there's many things that we can map. But in order to do all that, I think the resources and the time, etc., needs to be established that it's a project and it can continue.
Thank you. We'd like to hear from Nick as well. There's a note here. Please briefly mention your point on corrupt ghosts, quote unquote. You can, and then maybe explain how journalists can include this information in their narratives. Yeah, could you address that also, Nick? Yeah, please.
You mean the ghost that I didn't? That I didn't.
Corrupt ghosts.
That I didn't get a chance to present. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'll go very briefly. Within 2-3 minutes. So basically, just to address the first question first, that is a very, very difficult question. So I think like the biggest investigative journalist agencies in Thailand is still struggling with that. How to be sustained, how to live in this era of social media, etc. But my suggestion from the evidence that I have seen is to try to create a participatory platform with the people more. For example, in the case that I show, when people feel that their voice can be heard and their voice matters, for example, they can just take a picture of this light pole and they can send it to one of the news agencies, and then the news agencies investigate this case, and then it became a big stories in the country. They feel that, oh, this is not done or found by a very famous journalist, but just found by just a person who knows what names, and then it creates change. And then by doing this, people will feel that news agencies, like investigative journalists, matters. And as an evidence, the page that I am in relationship with, for example, the must share page, which got this picture from an ordinary citizens, got like 10,000 more like in a day. So if we translate that into monetary compensation, that's very highly significant for a news agency. So, but I do not really know if this can be generalized into a bigger picture, but to kind of like create an interactive interaction with normal citizens would be part of the answer, I guess. But you answer this questions. All of you answer this question better than me. And back to the ghost a little bit. That's the part that I didn't get the chance because I got my 30 minutes already. But I just want to explain that currently, like, economics has reached to a point that we are unable to explain many of the questions. So a relatively new approach of behavioral experimental economics has emerged. And they have been trying to explain cheating or corrupt activities as well. They do not believe that neoclassical economics like cause and benefit will explain everything. They try to understand why people behavior differs in different situation, circumstance. So, for example, we found that many of Thai politicians like to go to temples and make donations. And apparently those politicians are who go to the temple are those who just commit corrupt crimes. We look at their asset disclosure. So it is highly correlated with the amount of money they donated to the temple. So that's kind of like, we call it moral licensing. So it's so we compare it with non-ghosts who like going to temples and make donations, while before that they commit corruption crimes, and they do the donate to make them feel good about themselves. Or there are many other kind of activities. So in order to fight this kind of behavior, to counter this kind of behavior, we need to come up with other solutions rather than just higher democracy, more laws and regulations, and so on and so forth, by trying to nudge their behavior. For example, in one experiment, they put wording from the Bible in before politicians declare assets, and it apparently, when they see something like that and they sign that they will disclose with truthful information before writing the information, they tend to be more truthful to the information. So something as small as this could create big change. But again, this is a very small case. I may not be able to generalize this into a bigger picture, but it just opened up a new perspective to new solutions, to new perspective, new approach to tackle the problem. So maybe of interest to journalists who are interested in new approach.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers, Nick, Nadir, and Cynthia. I've personally been, I benefited from just listening to the discussions, the thoughts you shared. The challenge for us journalists is maybe, revisit our notion of corruption and how we frame corruptions, the narratives that we propagate, maybe directly or indirectly through our stories. But I want to highlight on a final note before we move on to Danny for the final remarks. I hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation around the potential for collaboration. It's high time that we in Southeast Asia, join forces and explored maybe more creative solutions to what's confronting us in the area of corruption. Certainly, as Cynthia has highlighted earlier, there's still a lot of room to explore in terms of stories to write, to put out. And in the meantime, corruption continues to evolve. So we need to be acting fast, soon enough. I think the momentum is there, and we need to be able to move forward, hopefully more constructively, if only to address what we've focused on during this day's discussion. So thank you everyone on behalf of Kini Academy, and thank you to all our participants